Okay, ready for this? We're diving deep into how to give bad news, but not just any bad news. We're talking about giving bad news in English. It's like, you're learning the secret language for handling all the tricky stuff, right? And for this deep dive, we've got this English learning podcast episode. So we're basically eavesdropping on how to deliver tough news without having to actually do it ourselves. Pretty sweet, right? And get this, by the time we're done with this deep dive, you'll not only understand these conversations, you actually be able to handle them yourself. We're talking like confidence, clarity, maybe even throwing in some fancy vocabulary while you're at it, ready to level up your English. So this episode, it just throws us right into the action, right? We're talking about a company and things are not looking good, and we've got Ed, he's the employee, and he's about to break some seriously bad news to his boss. Like, we're talking sales have tanked, the market's in a full-on recession, and there's even talk of bankruptcy. Intense, right? But before we even get to like the real bombshell, there's some really interesting vocabulary they throw around, like gory details. It's not just, details, it's the stuff you really don't want to hear.
Right, right. It's like they're emphasizing the hard stuff, the unpleasant side of things. Like, imagine you're about to hear some bad news. You might say, okay, just give it to me straight. I don't need the gory details.
Oh, I totally get it. And then there's another one, redundancies, which, okay, I learned this is what they call layoffs in British English.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? How different cultures use like different words for the same thing. Redundancies, it almost sounds kind of, I don't know, clinical. It's more about the position not being needed, not the person losing their job.
Right. It's like they're trying to make it sound less harsh, at least, in the words they're using. Okay, and then there's this other phrase, to shoulder the cost.
Yeah, that one is all about burden, right? Like literally carrying a heavy weight. Like the company had to shoulder the cost of the recall. You can almost feel the weight of that, right?
Absolutely. Okay, but vocabulary is just the start, right? This episode is packed with actual phrases for giving bad news. And some of them are like seriously clever. Like, how can I put this? Let's just say that.
Oh, that's a classic. It's like you're softening the blow.
Yeah.
You're giving them a little warning, a little pause before you hit them with the bad news.
It's like, get ready, things are about to get real. But, in a way that's not totally terrifying. Okay, and then there's the totally opposite approach. Lay it on me.
Oh, yeah. With that one, there's no messing around. Straight to the point, no chaser. It's like, hit me with it, I can take it.
Definitely cuts right through the tension, which I can imagine is helpful in those situations. And then there's that phrase we all know and love, for crying out loud.
Huh, that's the universal, like, are you kidding me? It's that moment when you just, like, can't believe how bad things are.
Okay, so now we're getting into the real meat of the bad news in the episode. Ed mentions filing for Chapter 11, which led to this whole discussion about bankruptcy.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? They use Chapter 11 almost like it means personal bankruptcy, even though it's really for companies.
Right, which makes you realize how much that term, Chapter 11, has become part of like everyday language, especially with all the economic craziness lately. But just to be clear, Chapter 11 is for businesses, like to restructure, and Chapter 13 is for like individual people, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Chapter 11 is like, you hit the pause button on your business,
Yeah.
figure out how to handle the debts, and hopefully, come back even stronger. Chapter 13 is more about making a repayment plan that actually works for someone's budget.
Gotcha. Okay, so this whole bankruptcy thing got me thinking. Because remember how the podcast hosts talk about how different cultures deal with debt and bankruptcy?
Yeah, yeah, and it's really fascinating how different those attitudes can be. In some cultures, debt is like this huge source of shame, but in others, it's just like a normal part of doing business. It really makes you think about the bigger picture.
Okay, so we've covered some pretty heavy vocabulary and phrases for, dealing with all these tough financial situations, but we're just getting started.
We've only scratched the surface of this English learning podcast. There's so much more to unpack, from business lingo to, like, cultural insights, all that good stuff.
Ready to keep digging? Let's do it.
Welcome back. So we've been breaking down this English learning podcast, right? And honestly, it's like this crash course in tough conversations, especially like all the money stuff.
Right. It's like they're giving us a toolkit for when things go wrong, but in English. And there's this one term they keep using, margin. I'm guessing they don't mean like the white space on a page, right?
Nope, definitely not. We're talking profit margin. It's like essential for any business.
Yeah.
Basically, it's the difference between how much it costs to make something and how much you sell it for.
Okay, so let's say I'm making like handmade scarves. I spend $10 on materials and sell them for $30. My margin would be $20.
Exactly. That $20, that's your profit. Your reward for all those hours spent knitting. The bigger the margin, the more money you make.
Makes sense. And they also kept talking about revenue. Where does that fit in?
Revenue is the total money you make from sales before taking out any costs. It's like your starting point.
Gotcha. So revenue is the big picture, and margin is how much you actually pocket from each sale.
Precisely. And getting these terms down, it's so important for, any business conversation in English, whether you're talking sales, negotiating prices, or even just understanding the financial news.
And this episode, it gets real about financial struggles too. They use some strong words like broke, which, I mean, we all know what that means.
Yeah, broke is like that universal feeling of having absolutely no cash. But it's interesting because it can also be used for like a temporary situation like, ugh, I'm broke until payday. Adds a bit of drama, right?
For sure. And then there's hit rock bottom, which is way more serious.
Yeah, rock bottom, that implies like real despair. Like you've hit the lowest point. Imagine losing your business, your savings, your home. That's hitting rock bottom.
Not a good place to be. But okay, on a more positive note, there's skyrocket, which is about things going up really fast.
Oh yeah, skyrocket. That's the opposite of rock bottom. Skyrocketing sales, skyrocketing profits. It's exciting. Things are taking off quickly.
It's amazing how, like, one word can create such a vivid picture. Okay, so we've got the financial vocabulary down. Let's go back to those phrases for dealing with bad news. Any more gems from this episode?
Oh, definitely. So we talked about giving bad news indirectly, but how about reacting to it? Like, spare me the gory details. It's a polite way of saying, like, you don't need all the painful details.
Right, like acknowledging the bad news but drawing the line. Like, okay, I get it, it's bad, but I don't need to hear every single awful detail.
Exactly. It's helpful when you need to focus on solutions, not dwell on the problem. Oh, and there was another phrase that came up. Quality control.
Yeah, that was when they were talking about those faulty products, right? Like, whose job was it to make sure things were, actually good?
Exactly. Quality control, they often shorten to just QC, is all about making sure products meet the standards. It's a huge deal in manufacturing, especially like with international business.
And speaking of global stuff, remember how the podcast encouraged us to, like, think about how different cultures view debt and bankruptcy? That feels really relevant here, especially when you're doing business with people from different backgrounds.
Absolutely. It's not just speaking the language, it's understanding the culture too. Like what might be a small setback for one person could be a huge crisis for someone else.
And the way you talk about these things, like your tone and everything, that can make a big difference in how people receive your message.
Totally. It's like navigating a cultural minefield sometimes. But hey, that's what makes learning English so interesting, right? It's like opening up this whole new world of understanding and connecting with people from different cultures.
I'm hooked. What else did they cover in this episode?
All right, so we've talked about a ton of vocabulary and all these phrases for like giving bad news in English. But this episode, it goes beyond just, the actual words, right? It's like they're getting at that human element, that like empathy thing, which is so important in these tough conversations. You can have perfect grammar, fancy vocabulary, all that. But without empathy, your message just won't land the same way.
Yeah, it makes me think about those times when I've been on the receiving end of bad news. And it really is like the way it's delivered makes a huge difference. If someone's like cold or impatient, it just makes the news even harder to hear.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Imagine like your boss telling you about layoffs and they're just like shrugging and saying, well, that's business. You wouldn't feel very good about it.
Right. No, not at all. So how do you bring in that empathy? Especially, when you're speaking in a language you're still learning.
It's like a bunch of things together, right? Your tone of voice, the words you choose, even your body language.
Yeah.
Think about like a doctor giving someone bad medical news. They might say, I understand this is difficult to hear, or I'm here to answer any questions you might have. It shows they're not just giving information, they're acknowledging how it makes the person feel.
Yeah, like it's almost like they're saying, I see you, I hear you, I'm here with you in this, which is like really powerful, even when the news is bad. And the podcast hosts, they also talked about like nonverbal communication, which feels even tougher to get right in another language.
Oh, for sure. Those little cues, they can be so subtle,
Yeah.
but they make a huge difference, like eye contact,
Hmm.
using a gentle tone of voice, even just like a nod to show you're listening. Those things can go a long way in showing empathy, even when you don't have the perfect words.
And sometimes the best thing you can do is just, be quiet and listen. Give the other person space to process, ask questions, all that.
Totally. Sometimes empathy isn't about saying anything. It's about creating that space for the other person to feel heard and understood.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it really feels like it's about so much more than just learning vocabulary. It's about communication, culture, and that whole human side of things, the empathy part.
All right, it's like they've given us this whole toolkit, not just for speaking English, but for handling all the tough stuff life throws at you in any language.
We've covered a lot, right? Vocabulary, phrases, cultural stuff, even how our body language plays a part. But the biggest takeaway for me, empathy. It's like the key that unlocks everything.
It's that bridge that connects us, even when things are rough. And that's a skill worth learning in any language.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into giving bad news in English. We'll catch you next time with another fascinating topic to explore.